Yeah.
Use this
Good afternoon, guys.
for my Zoom, but here I am. So welcome. The topic today is to compare as-is contracts to regular contracts. We'll talk a little bit about as-is contracts, since we seem to be taking a lot more as-is contracts than regular contracts, much to the dismay of broker Jeff, who's not a huge fan. If you sit on my contract classes enough, you'll realize that I'm not a huge fan of as-is contracts, and I'll try to explain why. I don't know whether I'll convert anybody, but I'll at least give you my thoughts. So I want to start out by talking a little bit about the market. Can everybody see that okay? So on your Southwest Florida MLS screen, there's a market watch. And I've not put out the Tuesday morning reports for the last couple of weeks because of the hurricane. And the hurricane had a pretty significant effect on market activity, especially when it came to new listings. But you take a look at this morning's market watch for the overall market, and look, we're back up to the levels that we were at pre-hurricane. So for those of you that think that everything's going to shut down or slow way down because of the hurricane, I don't see that happening. You know, new listings 500, almost 600, sold 519. That means a lot of transactions. A lot of transactions have taken place in the last 7 days. So we're still doing closings. We're still selling things. Many people were not, fortunately, as impacted by Ian as Fort Myers Beach and into areas of Pine Island and up to the north there, up to Sanibel, Captiva. You know, they were very heavily impacted, and obviously those sales are going to be impacted. The condition of the property is not even known. I think they just went on to Sanibel late last week. So they'll be the blighted areas, the really heavily impacted areas, are going to be significant. But if you take a look at what's happening, new listings 576, sold 519, pending 556, price decreases 437. Those are very consistent numbers to the numbers we saw in the last, I think I've been tracking it for about 18 weeks. So I'll put the numbers back out tomorrow, but just be aware that the market activity, while it dulled a little bit, obviously, because we were all dealing with the hurricane and lack of internet and so forth and so on, there wasn't, the areas that weren't damaged or were moderately damaged by some landscaping and wind activity, those properties will bounce back. And you can always go in now. Remember, we'll do a little bit of an exercise here, but if you got that market watch widget in the middle of your screen, you can always go in and take a look at what's happening and where these areas are. You can sort them by area. You can add a couple fields in here and sort them, take a look at them. But these are all brand new listings, and you can sort them down by geo area and take a look at different geo. These are Bonita, and so I mean, take a look at them, especially if you have an area that you are farming for or you're looking for a buyer, or an area that you're farming for a seller. You want to know all the new listings that come on the market, so you can easily set yourself up a search, and every time a new listing pops up in your market or the area where your buyers looking, you can get notifications right off of this system. So there's a lot of things you can do proactively to remain active in the market, stay in touch with your customers, and continue to do business. So that's why I wanted to show you that situation with the market. Obviously, different markets are going to be impacted, but those general areas in Southwest Florida, our market level activity appears to have returned to the where it was a couple weeks ago. Any comments or questions on that? All right. Let me talk a little bit about as is versus regular contracts. Okay, so it seems like back in the short sale days, probably 10, 15 years ago now, we got into a situation where the banks became active in the transactions because if it was a short sale, they had to approve the shortfall between what the seller could bring to the table in cash and what the property was worth versus what the mortgages were worth. And in back in those days, there was a tremendous amount of speculative lending, and the prices increased fairly rapidly as a result of the speculative lending. As I said, if you could fog a mirror, you could get a mortgage. And I was not as fortunate as you all. That was when I was first starting out as an agent, and I was like, wow, what do I do now? But in the end, we did a lot of short sales. We did a lot of foreclosures. And the market started to improve because we were able to use about 2008, I believe, or 2009, the Fed stepped in, the banks, and said, look, you can't carry a property that's worth $300,000 on your books just because you made a $500,000 mortgage loan. You have to, what they call, mark to market. So by the end of 2008, 2009, the market started to get more orderly, and the banks started embracing short sales and doing a little less foreclosure activity. But the point is that almost all of those contracts were written as is. The bank didn't know anything about the property. The buyers didn't know anything about the property, and what was pretty obvious was that if you were going to lose your home and you were trying to make payments on a mortgage that was far greater in many cases than the value of your home, you probably weren't taking the best care of it. So the as-is contracts came into vogue when the bank said, it's as is. I don't know anything about it. I got the home through distress. I don't know anything about it. I'm not going to make any repairs. Take it or leave it. So that was when we started to see a huge rise in as-is contracts. Same thing with short sales. Buyers are like, hey, I don't mind signing up to buy this house, but I want a free look before I have to go ahead in and buy it. So the predominant contract became the as is. So, really, people started to like that idea of a free look, and that really stayed with us through the period of time after 2012, 2013, when situations were more normal. But people kept in Lee County today, probably 90+% of the contracts are as is contracts. And in Collier, I would say it's probably maybe more 70-30 or 60-40, because sellers are starting to realize that as is contracts aren't the greatest thing since sliced bread, and that they're going to take their property off the market for 7, 10, 15 days, and at the whim of the buyer could go right back on the market. And we'll take a look at the language in the as-is contract here in a couple minutes. But basically, the as-is contract was designed to say, okay, I'm the seller. I'm going to give you some concession in the price because I know I don't have to make any repairs. You're taking it as is. And that has since morphed into a situation where it's as is except. Most as is contracts today, if you've been dealing with them, come with a few hooks. They're like, well, I really like this property, but I need a new air conditioner, or I need this, or I need that. And if you don't want to do that, that's fine. I'm gonna bail. And lately, in the huge inventory shortage months that we saw late last year and early this year, people were writing multiple as-is contracts. I don't know which house I want. I know they're competitive. I'm going to bid on 3 and I'll take the one I want. So that was plagued the market a great deal. I think some of that has gone away. We don't see as many multiple offer properties as we do, and we do, it's not quite as hysterical as it was. But still, more and more sellers I see are saying, don't give me an as-is contract. I don't want it. I've already had my house back on the market twice. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but most of all, we need to talk about the difference in the inspection process, because that's largely where the contracts differ. Someone asked in the chat, so the question I believe is Keller Williams, why is this chat doing this to me? Keller Williams a member of Stellar MLS? Yes, we are a member of Stellar MLS through the Punta Gorda board. If you want to use Stellar MLS, get out your checkbook. It's $200 to join the Punta Gorda board, and then $928 a year for your dues. Stellar MLS has like 40,000 members. They go all the way from Punta Gorda, Port Charlotte, up to almost up to Jacksonville on the one coast, and on up through Gainesville and north on the other coast. So it's a huge MLS. It's also very expensive, and it's requires that you take around 40 hours of MLS training in the first 30 days that you're a member, or they shut your service off. So if you're interested in making that plunge, email me. I'll send you the applications. I'm a little bit concerned, not to get on a bunny trail here, that people are like, oh yeah, I want to do business in Sarasota. I want to do business in Tampa. I want to do business in Lakeland. And I have to ask you the question, why? You don't know, unless you've lived there or continue to visit that area and are familiar with the market. My question is always, are you doing the best thing for your customer by trying to represent them in Tampa or Sarasota or Bradenton or Lakeland? To my knowledge, this is Southwest Florida. This is the market we work in. This is the market we study every day. This is the market we know well, and we offer a lot of added value to a customer who calls you and says, can you help me find a house in Southwest Florida? Even, can you help me find a house in Naples or Marco Island? But to try to join an MLS so that you can represent buyers and sellers in an area that you don't know much about is not, to me, a particularly good a way of thinking. Why not refer it? I mean, we recommend that you use the referral network within Keller Williams, and we recommend that if you use it thoroughly and properly, you can end up with about 20% of your income from referrals. So Christina, why would you want to join the Stellar MLS?
Thank you for, first of all, thank you for answering my question. I have a friend, a buyer who's actively looking in the Sarasota area, and this was purely to set them up right away with a search so they can see what's happening. They went into an open house, they put an offer, and their offer got rejected. There was a better offer out there, but they didn't have representation. So.
Okay, so there's another option for you if you want to set up a search for them in a market that you're not an MLS member, and that's called MLS Advantage. You can link to it on your main screen from MLS, and you can set up a search pretty much anywhere in the state.
Oh, so wonderful.
Pardon?
Thank you. Wonderful.
Have you tried that?
No, I have not tried that.
Okay. There is, Florida Realtors runs what's called MLS Advantage, which most MLSs are members of. I know we are not a member in Marco, not a member in Sanibel, but other than that, throughout the state, other than a few markets, our listings are syndicated every day to MLS Advantage. So you could go on there and set up a search for them. I don't recommend you invest the money and the time for Stellar unless you're really planning on doing a lot of business in those other areas. And if you are, I can recommend that you find a great agent in Sarasota or Tampa or yeah, that's a good point. You can set up a search in Command too. Command does have through the Keller Williams maintains its own internal MLS, but it's just Keller Williams listings, I believe. I don't think you'd see non-Keller Williams listings if you set it up in Command. I think you just see our listings because it's KWLS is what is shown in Command. But anyhow, I just think that the referral network is one of the great assets of being a member of Keller Williams. And it's very easy to connect to a member in Sarasota, Bradenton, whatever, set up a 25% referral and ask for them to communicate because these are my friends, I want to refer you. And most referral agents do a great job of that. We get a lot of referrals inbound into our area, but also I've encouraged people to work with realtors in Sarasota, Bradenton, Tampa, Gainesville, because that's not our area of expertise. So I think you could, if you properly use our referral network, you can, the rule of thumb, we have people that do 30-40% of their annual income with referrals, but 15 or 20% is not a difficult thing if you set yourself up using the KW referral network. You can actively seek and receive referrals through the KW system. So that's my thought, but I actually am a member of that MLS. So if it's some question that you have or some research you want done in the Stellar market, reach out to me. I'll help you with it. I don't have a problem with that. I just think that to invest that kind of money, if you're not going to do enough transactions to pay for the cost, then sorry for the bunny trail, but I think it was a great question and I'm happy to try to take your questions as we go along.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much.
Okay, no problem. That's what I'm here for. So let's go back to as-is contracts. So I'm gonna start with the NABOR as-is contract. We've done quite a few contract classes, and let's see if I can't pump that up a little bit. And we've been through the basic contract with the regular contract. The only difference in the as-is contract and the regular contract really has to do with inspections. So every bit of the first part of this contract, the financing contingency, everything is exactly the same. The disclosures, everything is identical between the two contracts. So you end up with really focusing just on the inspection criteria here. Page down. So let's go to the inspection paragraph here. I can find it. By the way, last week we spent time on the risk of loss and the seller's maintenance obligation having to do with any damages he had from Ian. They're identical in the two contracts. Here we go. So our main difference is paragraph 8 replaces all of the language in the contract that has to do with inspections. And this paragraph, actually, paragraph 8 in the as-is contract is the heart of the concept and the terms of an as-is contract. So basically, we are going to give the buyer X number of days to basically decide it's not acceptable for any reason. And during that due diligence period, the buyer can terminate. Obviously, if the buyer does not elect to terminate, here's the language of the contract. Seller shall have no obligation to make any repairs or replacements to the property, systems, and equipment, except as in standard D2A, buyer's right to terminate hereunder has been, now watch, has been bargained for between the properties, and each party acknowledges full and adequate consideration has been received for this provision. Now, what does that mean? That provision does not exist in the language of the FAR bar as is, but basically that we're giving the buyer a right to terminate, and generally we're giving them a little better price or maybe a concession to their closing costs or something as a result of the seller saying, hey, this is wonderful. I don't mind selling for a little less money. However, I don't have to make any repairs. So that was the concept back when the banks started requiring as-is contracts. Good luck asking a bank to replace the stolen air conditioner or to repair damage from a leak in the roof or from a window that got broken and rain came in. The bank said, this is the number we're going to sell it at, and this is the condition you're going to take it in. And rarely, if any, would a bank give you any concession other than take it or leave it. So that was the concept. And really the language in here is the right to terminate hereunder has been bargained for between the parties, and each party acknowledges full and adequate consideration has been received for this provision. What is full and adequate provision? A consideration, usually the price. So what we've seen now is because of the scarcity of inventory, there was not a lot of bargaining in the price, but the sellers were still accepting an as-is contract, meaning they're coming off the market for X days, and the buyer in that X day period can either decide to keep the property or move on. What happened over the last few years is I'm getting my cake and I'm eating it too, to a certain extent, because I'm going to ask you to take it off the market while I inspect it. But then prior to the end of my due diligence period, I'm also going to ask you for a credit, a lower price, or repairs. And those are the three things that come from negotiations for a regular contract. But now everybody said, well, I want as is except. Okay. I mean, that's essentially where we're at. In my humble opinion, having been doing this for 15 years, I think that this type of negotiations and transactions has lowered the level of professionalism in our industry. Because basically there are entire brokerage houses that say, we will only allow you to write an as-is contract and always ask for something in return, a repair, a credit, or whatever. And so essentially now we bargain for a price where there are no repairs, there are no concessions. And all of a sudden, wait a minute, you're asking me for a concession, you're asking me for a lower price, you're asking me to repair this or that or the other. And that's not what we bargained for. But that's what the industry has accepted as kind of a normal practice. So given that that's what this contract does and says, we've got a price, we've got a period of time, the buyer can inspect. And then prior to the end of the inspection period, we'll talk about this, you can't submit a buyer's election and seller's response within 5 days after your inspection period, as you can in the regular contract. You must submit, if you want any concessions from the seller in the form of repairs or credits, you must submit that to the seller in an amendment prior to the expiration of your inspection period. And if the seller doesn't take that amendment and return it to you during your due diligence period, and you let that lapse, you accept the property in the condition that it's in. Buyer's failure to terminate this contract in the manner provided herein shall constitute a waiver of the right to terminate under the provisions of this paragraph. There you go. So I can inspect, and if I want to revise the terms of the contract, which is essentially what you're doing when you're asking the seller for repairs or concessions, is you're modifying the terms of the contract. You are amending the contract. In FAR Bar, there is no amendment, so you would add an addenda saying buyer and seller agree that seller will make the following repairs. Seller will give the buyer a $5,000 credit at closing. Whatever the terms are, we're renegotiating the contract after it's been agreed upon. So what are some of the issues that come along with this type of negotiations? I've got a little slide presentation here that I'd like to go to that we did at stop the share. And this is a little PowerPoint that we put together and I did with a local attorney in at Nabor. You can see the screen and we can start the PowerPoint, hopefully. Okay. Can everybody see that okay? Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. So basically, we had a contract called negotiating inspections, which basically was dealing with the normal contract. Then we came back and said, okay, since a lot of people are doing as is contracts, let's just run through this, okay? So I won't go through in tremendous detail here, but what's the importance of the inspection? And oh, by the way, we came out with what's called a buyer's notice, that if your buyer says, I don't want to inspect, I don't care, I'll take it as it is, it'll make my contract stronger. We ask that the buyer sign a waiver which says, if I waive my inspections, I understand that I cannot go in the property after the contract is signed until my walkthrough inspection. Number one, most people don't realize that. They're like, well, I can still go in and look around, and take measurements and figure it out, but I'm not going to inspect. Nope, not true. You waive your inspections and put 0 days in the number of days. You are not entitled to go in that property until your walkthrough inspection. The seller can say, sorry, you waived your rights to inspect and enter the property. So when you waive your rights, what happens to what's we're going to talk about is the seller's maintenance obligation, which is the obligation of the seller to maintain the property and the condition was in at the time contract. So if I can't see the property between the time I agree on the contract and the time I go to my walkthrough, suppose it was very nice and cool, everything was very good at my last showing, we write the contract and I go to the walkthrough and it's kind of muggy and humid and not really very comfortable inside. Can I prove that that happened between the time we went to contract and the time we went to the walkthrough? Very difficult. I don't have anything in the baseline saying the air conditioner was doing this when I inspected it and now it's doing this. So I probably pretty much lose my seller's maintenance obligation. I lose the ability to go in through my walkthrough and ask for the seller to do anything other than if I can prove that it was the seller's maintenance obligation. So be careful about waiving inspections. I pretty much went on the warpath on this about a year ago, July, and I don't see it too much anymore. I see a lot of other brokers, a lot of other agents waiving inspections. I don't see our agents waiving inspections too much anymore. Maybe that's because broker Jeff was on the warpath, and whenever I saw a buyer that waived inspections, I pretty much reached out to you and said, okay, does your buyer know that they can't enter the property? Does your buyer know that they can't ask for anything unless it's glaringly obvious? And does the buyer know that after I move in, if I find a bunch of things that are wrong, who am I going to blame? The seller? No. I might blame my agent for not insisting that I inspect. So you be careful with that. So we're going to choose the inspection to be performed. We're going to research permitting and survey issues because the as-is contract is silent as to the seller's obligation to closed, open, and expired permits. So if I don't do that during my due diligence, which is normally not when it's done, I can forfeit the right for my buyer to ask a seller to close an open permit. The other thing here is that we've added some language that I've pretty much given out to everybody. If you don't have it, let me know, I'll email it to you. But basically it says that the seller must close all open and expired permits, any outstanding liens or code enforcement obligations must be addressed prior to closing. I'm adding that to the other terms and conditions because the as-is contract doesn't deal with that. So be careful when you're writing an as-is contract to always include that language, all right? With any kind of luck, I'll put it in the chat here in a couple minutes. So I can now, under the as-is, can I review the results and make requests to the seller? I can. That isn't the way the contract's written, but that's what happens in many cases. So for the seller, it's a discovery period. Maybe I didn't know there was some defective systems and equipment in my house. Maybe I didn't know the air conditioner wasn't cooling properly. Maybe I didn't know issues that were discovered by the buyer during inspections. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to confirm the accuracy. The buyer sends over an amendment saying, I really need you to repair or replace the air conditioner because it's not cooling properly. And here's my inspection report to back it up. Maybe the seller didn't know that. Maybe the seller says, wait a minute, hold it. I just had that air conditioner serviced 2 weeks ago. And I'm going to reach out to my AC repairman or AC service company and have them check out and see if that's true or not, or see if the buyer, I've seen buyers ask for a brand new air conditioner because the cover was all rusty on the outside compressor. In an as-is contract, can you do that? Sure. There is no defective and cosmetic in an as-is contract. It's whatever the buyer asks the seller to do and whatever the seller is willing to do. So how do I respond to a buyer's request on an as-is contract? I can say no, which is perfectly legitimate per the way the contract's written. Or I can say, maybe I have a problem. Maybe I should address this because if this buyer walks, the next buyer is going to come along, do the inspection, find the same thing. So of all the issues with an as-is inspection, one of the ramifications for a seller who's perfectly obligated to say, nope, not doing anything, didn't bargain for that, don't intend to. If the seller learns and the seller's agent, listing agent, learns that there's a truly defective condition, maybe it's a roof leak, maybe it's one of the appliances that isn't working right, maybe it's a electrical or plumbing issue, which would be truly defective under the definition of an inspection for a regular contract. Maybe the buyer's going to say, or the seller's going to say, hey, it's a problem, I'll address it. So even though I'm not a fan of as-is contracts, by the buyer doing their homework and asking the seller to address truly defective items, you got a good chance that the seller's going to say, well, it's defective. Here's the results. I'm going to verify it. But if it's defective, I'm going to do something about it rather than have it go back on the market and the next buyer comes along and says, this is a problem. So what are my options for proceeding? Should I just give the buyer a credit? Should I lower the purchase price? Or should I get the repairs done? We talked about waiving inspections. Please don't do it. It just isn't a good thing. And it isn't something that is going to help your relationship with your buyer if the buyer moves in and finds something that they really, would have liked to have addressed. So here's our timetable for as-is inspections. And again, maybe the only thing you need to know about an as-is contract versus a regular contract is strictly the inspection provisions and the seller's maintenance obligation. So buyer, this is the way the contract's written. Buyer accepts or rejects the property. You can't submit in the regular contract, the buyer inspects, they have 5 days afterwards to request, make a form called a buyer's request and seller's response. That's not applicable in this contract. You can request a repair or credit by an amendment to the contract, knowing though that it doesn't work like the regular contract where I have an inspection period. I have 5 days to ask the seller or to send my request to the seller. The seller has 10 days to respond to that request. And if the seller responds with a negative response saying, I'm not going to give you the credit you wanted, or I'm not going to repair that defective item, now the buyer has a 5-day window to cancel. None of that in an as-is contract. It's like, here's my due diligence period. By the end of that due diligence period, I either need to accept the property as it is, or I need to make sure well in advance that I've given the seller an amendment asking the seller for credit or repairs. And that's the difference. So I see as-is contracts reduced to 7 days, 5 days, even 3 days. Well, 3 days might be enough to get an inspector out there and get the report back, but is that enough time to write an amendment to the seller saying, hey, I really want you to consider these concessions? Probably not. It's probably difficult to get an amendment written over to the listing agent, get it to the seller. Seller has time to consider it because the seller's not just going to say, oh, I'll do all that. So give yourself some time. And if you're bargaining down your due diligence inspection period to less than 7 days, it's going to be hard for you to respond, get the inspection, make a request to the seller, and have the seller agree to it. Now, can you ask to extend the due diligence period? Yes, you can. Can the seller say no? Yes, the seller can. Well, there you go. So remember the underlying concept of an as-is contract. The seller has no obligation for repairs or credits. So why do people love as-is contracts? Because it's a free look, no obligation. I can put a contract on 3 houses, take the one I want. Not very professional, not very equitable or ethical, but can it be done with an as-is contract? For sure. Can the seller say no under any circumstances? Yes. So remember, I keep harping about this. You got to have that signed amendment back before your due diligence expires, or that amendment means nothing. Open expired permits, liens, code enforcement, liens are not, the code enforcement is not a lien, it's a code enforcement procedure. Termination. So none of those are addressed by the as-is contract. So again, we like the language that we put in to the contract that protects your buyer from see if I can find it real quick here. Anyhow, as we'll move on, I'll see if I can find the language for you. So here's the other thing that I think I know where I can find it. Here's another thing that I think you need to consider, and that's in the regular contract, whether it be FARBAR or NABOR, we go to great lengths to define what's defective, what's radon levels, what mold levels, what's a system and equipment not functioning as it was designed. There's none of that in the as-is contract. So that kind of cuts both ways. The seller really has to react to the buyer's request, regardless of whether it meets the test of cosmetic or defective. So there's not much protection for the seller other than to just say no. And for the buyer, in the as is contract, the buyer can pretty much ask for anything, but does the seller have to use licensed contractors? Does the seller have to follow the procedures for repair and review and proving that the repairs were done as they are in the regular contract? No. So you have to be kind of careful here in that the process is not quite as clean. There you go. Thank you, Maria. Properties to be made without any open or expired permits, municipal liens, or code violations prior to closing. Take a snapshot of that. If you're writing an as-is contract, put that legally attorney-approved language in the other terms and conditions, and you'll be protecting your buyer from something that is not covered by the as-is contract. So why would you write an as-is contract? A lot of times the agent will put in the notes that we want only as-is contracts. So let's talk about that a little bit. If the confidential remarks say that only as-is contracts will be considered, does that mean you have to submit an as-is contract? No. That means the agent is asking you to submit it. The agent is also required by real estate law to present any contract that you send to them. And if the seller only wants as-is contracts and sends that in writing to the agent, okay, the seller has the right to say, I only want as-is contracts. I don't know of too many sellers that I've known in my life that wouldn't take a good contract, regardless of the form, whether it's FAR, BAR, or NABO, or as is a regular. A seller wants to sell, they want an offer. If you feel more comfortable submitting a standard contract and the agent calls you back and says, only one as is, I'll say, well, the last time I looked that, you need to present all offers. Well, the seller only wants as is. Oh, great. Send that to me in writing. Silence. I don't have it in writing. The seller just told me. Really? Well, why don't you just present that offer and see what happens? And the frenzy has calmed down quite a bit now. It isn't like there's going to be 13 offers. But even if you write, I don't want as-is contracts, the seller will not accept them. And somebody sends you in an as-is contract for 10% over your list price. Is your seller going to consider it? Of course they are. So specifying what type of contract that you need to write is only in the mythical legend of the listing agent's mind, usually. I have talked to one listing agent one time who sent me a letter from the seller saying, I only want as-is contracts. That's one time that I've challenged that, and it happened to be an agent that was pretty sharp, and she said, hey, here's my letter. Seller says they only want as-is contracts. But very rarely, most of the time, that's the listing agent deciding that that's the way they want to do business. So again, remember, in this class, I taught this with an attorney. Can you employ an attorney to write a decent amendment, asking for the repair to be made, asking for only licensed contractors, asking for receipts? And can you do that? Sure. Can you do that as an agent? I don't think so. I think that's practicing law without a license. But would your seller be better off, or excuse me, your buyer be better off spending a couple $100, having a lawyer draw up a nice, tight amendment that protects the buyer from the seller saying, oh, my Uncle Jim, he knows something about air conditioners. I'll have him come over and fix this air conditioner for that buyer. Is there anything in the as-is contract stopping that? Nope. The seller agreed to have the air conditioner looked at and repaired. So be careful with that. There's no such thing as a repair or a credit that's defined in an as-is contract. If you're asking for a repair, ask for it with a licensed contractor. If you're asking for a credit, back the credit up with an estimate that you got Don't just say, I need $8,000 credit or I'm want to walk away. Generally not a great solid position for your buyer.
So Jeff, I have a question for you.
Go ahead.
They still, even with the as-is contract, the seller still has the maintenance obligation.
Correct.
Is it assumed then that even though, you know, it is an as-is contract, an inspection will be conducted and then that becomes your baseline?
Correct.
Okay,
So your baseline is what you use to enforce the seller's maintenance obligation. So I go in, the inspector finds that the cooling range for that particular air conditioner should be 19 degrees and it's 13 degrees. So now you have a condition which would be defective under the regular contract. So you can certainly send that information to the seller with an amendment saying, fix the air conditioner. What if the seller says, nope, it's as is, I'm not touching it? Okay, now I go to my walkthrough and I find that the air conditioner is still not cooling properly. Do I have the ability under the as-is contract to enforce the seller's maintenance obligation? Absolutely, just the way you do under a regular contract. The seller is obligated under the as-is contract to maintain the property in condition was in when he went to contract. Can the seller argue it didn't work when he went to contract? Doesn't work now? Possibly, possibly. But now you've notified him that there's a defective condition on your amendment. And I think you have the right to ask the seller to address that as part of the seller's maintenance obligation. But if you don't inspect and you don't have a baseline, it's very difficult to do that. So just briefly, a little bit on defective versus cosmetic. Okay, now remember, we go to great lengths to define this in the regular contract. None of this is particularly defined at all in the as-is contract. Can you use it as a standard to ask for repairs? Sure. Does the seller have to do them? No. But we go to great lengths. Now, can I ask the seller in an as-is contract to replace the missing screens? Sure. Does the seller have to do it? No. Is it part of the seller's maintenance obligation? No. They weren't there when you started. So remember, if you're going to use an as-is contract, remember these key points. If you're going to ask for a repair and it's a defective item, you got a pretty good chance that the seller will take a look at it, because if you walk away, another buyer walks in, does the same inspection, the request is going to be the same. So there is some leverage in an as-is contract to find and ask the seller to address defective items in the form of getting a repairman out there. And I don't think it's you don't require a lawyer to say, hey, have the air conditioner serviced by a licensed air conditioning professional and provide receipt. I don't think you need a lawyer to write that, but make sure you protect your buyer for the type of repair that's being done. And if it's truly a defective item, you may have some leverage to get the seller to look at it rather than lose the sale. So this is the form that we use for the regular NABOR contract. I see these things being submitted with as-is contracts. Why not? Because it doesn't mean anything. This form is addressed in great detail in the regular contract. It's not addressed at all in as-is. Can you use this? For sure. You write an amendment, specific requests, seller signs it prior to the expiration of your due diligence period, you got a deal. You've amended the contract to incorporate repairs or credits. So whether or not we're dealing with a regular contract or an as-is contract, how do we get paid? We get paid because we're able to keep the deal together. We're able to bring it to the closing table. So if you're in an as-is contract and you send over an amendment asking for what are clearly cosmetic conditions. Does the seller have an inclination to accept them? No. Does the seller, maybe you might anger the seller a little bit. The seller might just say, forget it, I'm not doing any of it. I'll put the property back on the market and deal with somebody that's willing to deal fairly and honestly. If you're going to ask for a credit, get a couple estimates. Now, again, the standard inspection period is 15 days. That gives you a chance to inspect, get the report back, find out how much a professional would charge you to fix the air conditioner or repair the pool pump or whatever. But I say get at least two. If your inspection period is 6 days, 5 days, 7 days, do you have time to inspect, get a couple estimates and put an amendment together to the seller a couple days in advance so that the seller can look at it and improve it? Probably not. I'd be careful with inspection periods less than 7 days. Leave ego and emotions out of the process. Okay. You're the licensed professional. Your job is to remain calm and try to keep the deal together, try to keep the parties talking. The minute ego, the immovable object, faces the irresistible force, you got angst and you've lost control of the process. Seller and agents must accept the responsibility and must disclose defective items to future buyers, okay? So if you have a truly defective item, the roof leaks, the air conditioner doesn't cool properly, the pool pump leaks. If you're the seller or the agent, do you have a responsibility to disclose that to the next buyer? Does it materially affect it's not readily observable, and does it materially affect the value of the home? That's Johnson v. Davis. Yes, you have the obligation. And if you're the agent, now you're a realtor. Now you have the code of ethics that says, hey, I'm obligated to deal honestly and fairly with people and to let them know anything that I know that could materially affect the value of the property. Another thing is, if you're the buyer, you may say, look, I'll take a couple $1,000 credit for the air conditioner repair. I'll do it myself because then I can hire who I want. And I know that I'll be the vendor that's going to do this is accountable to me, not the seller. The seller's inclination may be to do it, maybe to band-aid the air conditioner, put in one of those capacitors, that quick start capacitors that starts a compressor that's starting to fail. Can the seller do that? Is that a legitimate air conditioning repair done by a professional? Yes. If the air conditioner goes out 2 weeks after the buyer moves in because that Band-Aid didn't work for very long, that's where maybe you as an agent want to consider giving them a basic home warranty as a closing gift. $300 or $400. I used to do that when I was an agent. I used to make that a best practice of mine, unless it was a brand new house, unless the inspection was very, very good and very clean. There's nothing wrong with buying that home warranty that covers them for the first year they're there. And if the air conditioner breaks, then you're not leaving them high and dry. So that's why I think sometimes you might want to have your buyer take a credit rather than have the seller do what sellers do. What's the least costly way I can do this and still be legit? So if you remain calm and you try to establish a decent dialogue with the other side, chances are maybe you can get a concession that you otherwise wouldn't get. Chances are you can say to the agent, hey, I know the seller has said no repairs, but there's really some problems with that air conditioner. And if the seller's not willing to give us a credit or have somebody address it, the next buyer is going to come along, because we're not going to move forward, and the next buyer is going to come along, find the same thing. So maybe you can have a nice line of conversation with the listing agent, if you're representing the buyer, and say, hey, why don't we work this out? So thank you, Maria. Here is the seller's maintenance obligation. It is the thread that runs true, whether it's an as-is contract or whether Hurricane Ian just came through. The seller is obligated to maintain the property in the condition it was in on the effective date. Did they have some shrubs and some landscape damage as a result of Ian? Risk of loss says that the seller must provide repairs up to 1% of the value of the contract. Seller's maintenance obligation. Includes landscaping, systems, equipment, and personal property. So if there's items on that inventory, let's say it's the lanai furniture. And let's say the wind came along and smashed up the lanai furniture, didn't hurt anything else, and let's say that lanai furniture was on the list of personal property that was going to convey at closing. Does the seller have the obligation to repair or replace the lanai furniture? Yes. So that's the protection for the buyer, that I can't, as the seller, go, man, I turned the sprinklers off, I'm going to cancel my service calls, I'm just going to ride this out until I can make it to closing and let the buyer figure it out. That's why we have this. Normal wear and tear, that's not something that you can ask for. So if you find the seller's maintenance obligation, you find a deficiency, the air conditioner was cooling great, you go to the walkthrough, it's hot, it's sticky in there, you're like, okay, Mr. Seller, you have the obligation to take remedial action prior to closing, or provide a credit, or in the NABOR contract, we'll escrow up to 200% of the cost of taking that remedial action. In FAR/BAR, it's 125%. This is money that's set aside out of the seller's proceeds until the condition is cured. A receipt is sent to the escrow agent, usually the title company or attorney, of a satisfactory repair. That then triggers the repair activity or payment for the remedial action out of the escrow account. If there's money left over, it goes back to the seller. However, in the NABOR contract, that money that's escrowed is not a cap on what has to be repaired. So we put $1,000 into an escrow account for the seller to repair the air conditioner. Repair costs $2,000. Is the seller capped at well, in that case, we put 200% in, so we had 2,000. Let's say the repair exceeded the escrow. Does the seller have to pay that? Yes. The escrow is not a cap on what the seller has to pay to complete the remedial action. So walkthrough inspections, to me, one of the most critical parts of the entire contract. Okay. And the reason is that's your chance with your buyer to have a look at the property to make sure that it's in the condition that it was in when it went to contract. If there were repairs, make sure those repairs are done properly. That's your buyer's chance. Did they swap out the really sharp Samsung washer dryer for your basic scratch and dent unit? Were all of the things we had on our inventory listed, are they all there? That's your only chance. Oh, I opened the garage. Oh man, it's still full of garbage. There's still paint cans hanging on the wall. There's trash in the trash cans. Not broom swept condition. I have the right to ask the seller to either address it before we close or put some money in for that garage to be cleaned out and put in the condition that it is supposed to be in by contract. So there's a lot of different levels that happen in the walkthrough inspection. Please don't volunteer to be the buyer's designated representative for the walkthrough. This is a bad choice on your part, because our E&O coverage will not cover you if you go to that house and tell the buyer everything's fine and the 85-inch plasma over the top of the fireplace that fit there perfectly, that the buyer wanted and the seller agreed to leave there, if it's not there anymore and you don't catch it, you're headed to Best Buy. And believe me, it's happened. We've had to negotiate what model was there and what model is going to get replaced at the agent's expense because the agent missed it. Don't recommend you go there. What can you do? Have if you had an inspector, generally for $100, somewhere in that neighborhood, the inspector will come back, give them enough notice. They'll come back and they'll go through all the points that the seller agreed to repair. They'll make sure the repair is done properly. I had one where it's a second floor condo, and there was a hall storage closet right as you walked into the right. We opened that up and we noticed some moisture right around the grout line of the tile where the baseboard was. Don't know what it was. Put it on there as a defective condition. Got the receipt back that, oh, that was just, we just caulked along the baseboard there. It was just a little moisture, no problem. So the inspector goes in and runs the shower, because the shower is right behind the closet. What happened? It was leaking. So they tried to cover up with a little bit of caulk a leaking shower pan. Was it a good idea that we brought the inspector and the inspector figured that out? Replacing that shower pan and retiling, $5,000. So we asked for a $10,000 credit or escrow to be set up. They gave us a $6,000 credit at closing. The buyer had the work done. That's why you bring somebody back with you that can catch that. Would I have caught that? Caulking looks pretty good to me. It's not wet or anything. Let's go. That's where you get yourself into trouble and where you're operating out of your area of expertise. So your broker's E&O will not cover you on those issues if you take the responsibility to do it. So can you bring a neighbor in there? I mean, I always try to bring the inspector if there's repairs involved. Can you bring a neighbor? Can you have the inspector recheck the cooling level of the air conditioner? It's a few seconds to put the thermometer into the plenum and check it. Can you have the inspector do a few things to make sure that there's no imminent problems that the buyer's going to inherit? Yes. Can you do that? Probably not. Okay, so we know when I talk about the first part of the contract where there's in the NABOR, there's a pretty exhaustive list of things that are real property and personal property that convey, including the washer dryer, which is not included in FAR/BAR, which if you don't include it, again, you may be headed to Best Buy. So what is my, taking enough of these classes, you'll realize that Broker Jeff says in tennis, love means nothing. In real estate, as shown, turnkey, furnished, partially furnished, as per MLS, means exactly what love means in tennis, nothing. Absolutely unenforceable if you don't have a signed off list. Could be photos, could be a written list, signed off by buyer and seller. I'm going through my walkthrough. Wait a minute. That TV above the fireplace was on this list. It's not there now. Can I enforce that? Absolutely. Can I enforce it if I wrote as per MLS and there was a picture in the MLS of that TV up there? No. We've had buyers come back to us and go, I noticed a lot of things weren't there. Seems to me that there were a lot of things that I noticed were there when I did my final showing before the contract. And then look, here's the MLS pictures you sent me. It's right there. There's a TV. Does any of that mean anything? Nope. Who's the buyer going to be unhappy with? Whose relationship is going to be strained by that? We had a couple, one not too long ago. The buyer was a realtor. Got a referral fee. Walked through, said there's a couple things missing. Don't worry about it. Let's close. It's fine. And now wants to come back to the realtor and say, you owe me for those things that weren't there. Well, how do you know they weren't there? Well, I looked in the drawers. There was, he didn't have any leg to stand on. He didn't have a list of things that were there. He just said, there's a lot of things that I noticed that weren't there. Sorry. It's just one of those things where good practice is, obviously, if you're a listing agent, put the inventory out there, have the buyer and seller sign off on it, save yourself a lot of emotional trauma and aggravation, and save yourself a big strain on your relationship with your customer. Get an inventory. So maybe the listing agent didn't, it's turnkey, don't worry about it. No, I think I'm the buyer's agent. I think I want to go to that property with my camera or my list or both. I think I want to make a complete inventory. I think I want to send it over to the other side and say, here, sign this. This is what we're expecting to be there when it goes to close. So the seller must escrow 200% of the estimated cost of the remedial action. Now we're in an as-is contract, but that doesn't mean that the seller didn't have the obligation to maintain the property. Fairly simple. I was working with one agent that when they went back for the walkthrough and there was this big crack in the driveway and it was leaking water. They're like, was that there when you did your inspection? Did the inspector note it? No, the inspector noted the driveway was smooth and clean. Here's the picture. The seller said, tough, I'm keeping your deposit if you don't close. We said, welcome, Mr. Seller, to my buyer's attorney who's willing to take legal action against you. Oh, okay. Sure enough, they had to dig the driveway up, found a plumbing, big piping leak and fix it. That's why we have these, we go to great extent in these contracts to write this language in to protect the buyer and to protect the seller, to make sure that we have a pretty much of a level playing field that everybody can operate on. Always do the walkthrough. I've seen people say, yeah, we were in there, last week and everything was fine. We were in there to measure drapes. The seller gave us permission. Everything looked fine. I'm going to pass on the walkthrough. So if you let your buyer make that decision and the buyer moves in and there's trouble in River City, there again, are they going to recommend you to one of their friends? Are they going to call you back 2 years from now when they want to sell that condo and move into a bigger house? Maybe not. So there you go. That's it with the PowerPoint. But the PowerPoint, I'm a PowerPoint guy. The PowerPoint gives us a chance to really explore all aspects of the as-is versus regular contract. And again, I still believe that the regular contract serves both parties better. There's an addendum to the contract that I still recommend. Let me look at something here, see if I can find that real quick.
Hey, Jeff.
Yes, go ahead.
So I had a buyer that submitted an offer on a house, and the roof during the inspection had missing tiles, cracked tiles, and the seawall was buckling in, but no seawall company would say that it was not structurally sound. They won't do it. So my buyer said, well, next time around, Because those are defective items. Clearly, they're defective items, but unless you can get somebody that's an expert to say they're defective, which they wouldn't do. It was his reason for the next time around wanting to use an as is.
Okay,
So because there's so much gray area in some things that are considered defective or not. And those were big ticket items in his mind. So, you know, what would you say to that buyer?
well, first of all, I'm a little bit shocked that a seawall company would look at a bulging seawall and say, well, it looks like it needs to be replaced, but I'm not going to say it in writing. I think there's probably some pretty credible seawall people in town that would at least come back and say, you know, this needs to be further evaluated, if they couldn't do it during that inspection time.
Right. Well, that was Collier Seawall. I mean, I don't know who else, they're reputable, right? They're one of the most expensive, if not the most expensive here. They just would not put it in writing, not officially. They did it in an email to the buyer, but they would not write it out.
Well, yeah, that email to the buyer might have been enough to convince the seller to, but you know, like, so you're saying that the buyer lost their deposit because they were in a regular contract and couldn't prove that the seawall is defective?
Well, they ran the risk of that, obviously, because they couldn't prove that any of these, they didn't really care about the little things, but the big ticket items like this were truly defective because the inspectors wouldn't go to bat for them. So that was the reason why he then said, why would I not use an as-is contract going forward? Because then I have my inspection period, which I define, whatever, 15 days, 20 days, and then I can walk away. I don't have to run the risk of having to have an inspector then say it was defective. I can make that choice on my own.
Well, you know, there are reasons to use the as-is contract. And that may be a very good one. I've got an alternative up here called the right to inspect and right to terminate, which is available for both contracts. And I don't write that many contracts anymore, but I normally always write with this addendum instead of an as is. This gives me a chance to do my inspections, but if I move forward, everything reverts back to a normal contract. So I have 7 days, 10 days to check my flood insurance, to do my basic inspection. And then if I decide that there are some items on there that are truly defective, but I want to move forward, I now have the right, and your buyer would have the right to go in, present the inspection results from the seawall to the seller and say, this is a defective condition. You have pictures, you know, you don't necessarily have to have a 38-page report from the seawall company. You have an email from the seawall company saying there's a problem with the seawall. And then you ask the seller, and if the seller says, no, I'm not fixing that, you're out. Clearly a defective item, seller refuses to repair it, you're out. That would be my thinking. I like this approach 100% better than the as-is approach, because I still get my due diligence period, but I don't have the right to just ask for a credit, ask for repairs, and I do have the right to all the permitting provisions of the main contract and all the defective and cosmetic provisions. And that, so the contract calls for a normal inspection cycle if I decide to move forward. To me, this is the best of both worlds. The problem is most listing agents don't understand it. They're like, well, this is just like an as is. No, it's not like an as is. What it is a due diligence period. If we decide to move forward, it's a normal contract. I can't ask you to fix things that aren't defective. I can't ask you for credits for things that aren't defective. I can't ask you to repair defective items or give me a credit. And if you fail to do that and it's truly a defective item, I can walk away. To me, that makes a lot more sense. I had one that I was working on with an agent a couple of weeks ago. The listing agent, this is just as is. I said, well, give me 2 minutes. Let me explain. And she said, wow, that makes a lot of sense. I've never seen that used. So, you know, sometimes you have to sell your solution. But to me, your buyer would be better off with this situation than they would with just an as is. The level of proof for a defective item in an as is contract is, I ask the seller says no, I walk away. Does that mean the seller is saying no to a defective condition? Possibly. That would otherwise bind him or her in the regular contract. What do you think, Maria?
Yeah, I understand. I like it.
So that's my, I mean, I've been a proponent of this addendum for a long time, and I've actually converted a number of agents, but the feedback is always the agent on the other side doesn't understand it. They just want as is. But
Well, I think a lot of the agents don't even just understand the as is, period.
true. So in the case that I just used this a week or so ago, I was able to sell it to the listing agent. The listing agent said, well, that makes a lot of sense. Just never seen it before. So I would rather see this approach than I would see the as is. Just saying. I think it's a lot more professional than the as is. I think that's, to me, what's happened is we have more and more agents writing more and more as is contracts without having any understanding of how they work.
Well, and I think there's a lot of agents out there that were actually promoting it to the buyers. And
Yeah.
so then, because I had a client that had a friend and, oh gosh, their agent said they should always use this as is contract.
Well, there's whole brokerages that I want you to write it as is, and then make sure you ask for what you want. I had an agent in a contract class saying, I use the as is because that's just my start of where I'm negotiating the price. Great.
Did you say they are going to eliminate this as is from the neighbor
Now,
forms?
they're going to
No.
eliminate the check box that turns the regular contract into an as is. If you want to submit the as is contract, submit it. If you want to submit a regular contract, submit it, but don't submit a regular contract with an as is addendum, which turns the whole contract into as is.
Okay.
That's all. The reason the as is addendum will stay is that a seller can counter with an as is addendum. But to say I'm going to enter into a regular contract, but I'm going to have the as is addendum, it's like, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, to be honest. I mean, I've seen it done, but it's only because people weren't aware. Oh, I didn't know there was an as is contract. Well, we've had the as is contract now for 3 or 4 years. So I think it's a minor change. If it causes more people to use the regular contract, fine with me. But I think the due diligence period is kind of important because insurance is very much up in the air. Flood insurance and homeowners insurance are becoming very big factors in the cost of carrying the property. And the contract doesn't provide you, the standard contract says that you already investigated that before you went to contract. And that may be more doable now because the frenetic pace of the market has calmed down quite a bit. So you do have a couple days, and now you can call an insurance agent and get a flood quote and a homeowner's quote, fairly quickly. So you can check some of those things that you otherwise would use the due diligence period for. But this allows you to go ahead and do your inspection. If it's totally not for you after you see the inspection, fine, you're out. But if you move forward, to me, it's much more fair to the seller, because you can only ask the seller to address items that are truly defective. You can't ask them for, new air conditioner because the cover's rusty. So to me, this is the best of both worlds. Obviously, as an agent, you have to decide, what you think is best for your customer. Or if you call broker Jeff, he'll tell you it's not an as is, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a place for as is, and that there are people that are devoted to as is contracts. I think they're great, including several attorneys that I've talked to. When I explained to them some of the other sides of the coin, they're like, "Oh, I didn't think of that." So it's the jury's still out, but the majority of contracts being written in our world today are as is. So if you're going to write it, understand the limitations, understand that you add that language that Maria put in the chat into your other terms and conditions to protect your buyer from permit and lien issues, and try to be as fair in asking for any kind of concession as you can. Back it up with an estimate, back it up with an inspection report. You may have the same leverage, but just the process by which the seller agrees to the repair, provides the repair, is not defined. So you may have to define it. It's 2:57. How did I do?
Very good, Jeff. Thank you, sir.
All right.
Excellent. Thank you.
All right.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff.
We'll see you all next week. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.